Chapter 5 of The Way to Willpower by Henry Hazlitt. Chapter 5, Resolutions Made and Resolutions Kept. The trouble with the average man is not that he neglects to make resolutions. The trouble is that he makes far too many resolutions. Making resolutions is sometimes his principal daily occupation. He is forever forgetting or breaking them, and that is why he has to make them all over again. You, O reader, have probably been through this experience so often that you dislike to be reminded of it. It is probably your consciousness of past events that has tempted you to read this book. Now, there is something to be said for you. You realize your imperfections. You are splendidly dissatisfied with your present habits, your present mode of living, your present station in life. You say to yourself, "This will never do." You see things as they would be if you could get up earlier in the morning, if you could break that absurd habit of setting your alarm clock for 7, getting up, shutting it off, going back to bed with the honest intention of taking just a 5-minute snooze, and not waking up until 7:45. Ridiculous as it is, this habit repeats itself, morning after morning. You jump up with a start. You have a wild notion that the alarm clock has played a trick on you. You dress in 6 minutes, shave in 4, bolt your breakfast, make some excited, irritated, unkind remarks to your wife, start for the station or the streetcar like a man in a walking race. Break into a run, curse the line waiting for tickets, and when you are finally aboard your train, which trudges along and loiters around stations as if all eternity were before it, you say to yourself, "This will never do." In that ride on the train to your office, you see things as they might be. You see yourself getting up at 7, dressing at your leisure, eating breakfast in an expansive mood. No friction, no irritation, no squabbles with friend or wife, no dreadful fear that you are going to miss your train, or that somebody will look first at you, at the clock, and then at you as you come in the office. In that ride on the train, you have glimpsed perfection. And you make a tremendous resolution. This thing has been going on long enough. It's preposterous. It has got to stop. Tomorrow, I will get up at 7. And what happens? Well, you arrive at the office, and there are a number of things to occupy attention. Your resolution temporarily drops out of mind. Jones, my chief illustrative standby, wanders in and suggests his little game of poker that night. It is conceivable that you are not ashamed to protest and that you indicate your new desire to keep early hours. Jones assures you it won't be long, just a hand or two. You go. You arrive home at 1:30, having had, in the main, an evening not too stupid, but inwardly grumbling that you got back so late, or that somehow you couldn't have spent 5 hours at Jones's house and still have arrived home 2 hours after you left home. You go to bed. You sleep. The alarm rings. 7 o'clock. You get up, automatically, in a daze, angry and resentful against the alarm that you yourself have set. You shut it off. You turn back toward the bed like a marionette without consciousness of a decision or of any thought whatsoever. You retrace your steps. You are about to get into bed again. A vague recollection of yesterday's resolution, and perhaps also it is the resolution of the day before yesterday, and of the day before that, flits uneasily across your mind. But you are sleepy. Sleep is indispensable. The trouble yesterday was not that you went back to bed, but that you overslept when you got there. Just a 5-minute snooze. You awake. 10 minutes to 8. Impossible! And in the midst of your 5-minute dress and your 3.5-minute shave and your bolted breakfast, you still have a corner of your mind that is reflecting on what an ass you have been, and making a resolution that this must be stopped. And so on, as one day follows another. The example is chosen at random. It is not an extreme example. It is not the most powerful I could have selected. But it suffices to illustrate my point. The trouble is that even in your moments on the train, you never sufficiently convinced yourself that you really wanted to get up and stay up when the alarm rang. At 9 o'clock in the morning, on your way to work, you have been thinking only of one side of the case. And at 7 o'clock the next morning, you have been thinking only of the other side. Understand me, I am not saying that it would be to your advantage to make that resolve on the train. I do not contend that it would be better to get up at 7 and take your time than to get up at 7:45 and hurry. You are the judge of that. I disclaim any moral attitude whatever. But I insist that if you do make a resolve, it should be carried out. There should never be an exception. This point is supreme. To make a resolve and break it is demoralizing. Though not a single other soul on earth should know it, though God himself should not know, you would know it. You would have to confess your failure to yourself. To break a resolve is to undermine your self-respect. To break a resolve is to lose faith in yourself. It shakes your confidence that you can keep any other. The next time you become suddenly disgusted with any action or habit, and you clench your teeth in your left fist, and are just about to drive your left fist into the open palm of your right, and say to yourself, "The next time you're apt to stop short, and think of your previous failure, and the bitter irony of it all may rush over you. You start at the very beginning with an unwholesome doubt of whether you are going to keep your resolve. And when self-respect and self-faith are gone, nothing else is worthwhile. But with every resolution kept, be it ever so small a resolution, your faith in yourself grows. The keeping of the next resolution becomes tremendously easier. Willpower comes into its inheritance. The moral of all this is that you should make fewer resolutions and keep more. The foolish resolution is the resolution made in a moment of passion and self-disgust. It is well that you should have such moments. It is of such moments that great achievements are born. But before you make a resolve that you seriously mean to execute, look at it coldly and completely. Think not alone of the benefits of keeping it, but of the disadvantages. If you have been lying in bed until 7:45, you have not been doing so unless there were some advantages in lying in bed until 7:45. Consider these advantages in the moment of your resolve. Do not pass them over in contempt. Weigh them at their full value. Measure the sacrifice of forsaking them. Balance it against the advantages of getting up promptly at 7. You may decide that getting up promptly at 7 is not worth its price. You may decide to compromise on 7:30, which would allow you half an hour's more sleep and a little more time to dress. Upon what you decide, it is not for me to comment. But your decision should be carried out. No more demoralizing course could be conceived than daily to resolve to arise at 7 and the next day always to wait until 7:45. Such a course comes only because, when you make your resolves, you do not fairly face the price. This rule is so important and has so wide a bearing that we cannot forsake it here. It applies to all our resolves. Let me illustrate with the example that has become the favorite with all writers on the will. I refer to drinking. The lawmakers insist on solving this particular will problem for us, but the constitutional amendment, so far as I am aware, puts no ban on its invaluable use as a literary example. Moreover, I cannot be arrested for pointing out that the actual temptations of drinking are not altogether a thing of the past. You have a drink, then another. Perhaps you have one or two more, though the count becomes rather confusing after a time. The liquor touches the spot, as you say, and for a time it produces a mental and emotional reaction that is highly delightful. But the next morning, your stomach is upset. Your food doesn't taste right. You have a headache. Your mental and physical movements are slow and listless. You get little work done. The color of the universe is drab. You are probably minus a good deal of money. You feel your self-respect slipping. You are losing the respect of your friends. And you resolve that morning, accompanied by the usual terrible knitting of brow and clenching of fist and of teeth, as if that helped. And your resolve that morning, accompanied with the usual terrible knitting of brow and clenching of fist and of teeth, as if that helped, is that these occasions of getting drenched must forever cease, end, terminate. And then what? That acute psychologist William James can tell you much better than I. Quote, "How many excuses does the drunkard find when each new temptation comes? It is a new brand of liquor which the interests of intellectual culture in such matters oblige him to test. Moreover, it is poured out, and it is a sin to waste it. Also, others are drinking, and it would be churlishness to refuse. Or it is but to enable him to sleep, or just to get through this job of work. Or it isn't drinking, it is because he feels so cold. Or it is Christmas Day. Or it is a means of stimulating him to make a more powerful resolution in favor of abstinence than any he has hereto made. Or it is just this once, and one doesn't count, etc., etc. ad libitum. It is, in fact, anything you like except being a drunkard. That is the conception that will not stay before the poor soul's attention. But if he once gets able to pick out that way of conceiving from all the other possible ways of conceiving the various opportunities which occur, if through thick and thin he holds to it, that this is being a drunkard and nothing else, he is not likely to remain one long. The effort by which he succeeds in keeping the right name unwaveringly present to his mind proves to be his saving moral act." End quote. And how is he to get able to pick out that way of conceiving and hold to it? There is only one way. Not in the moment of temptation, but in the moment of his resolve on the morning after. That is the time for him to summon all these excuses before him, to bring up every possible excuse, to think of every conceivable advantage of drinking, and then to ask himself whether they are powerful enough to offset the conception of being a drunkard, or whether the advantages of drinking outweigh its disadvantages. He must give an honest answer then. If he ignores these excuses on the ground that they are unworthy his noble resolve, he will find them dancing before his eyes in the next moment of temptation. And not having faced and answered them when he was in the mood to face and answer them, he is not likely to face them in that unhappy moment. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Success and the capital S. I come now to a question, always thought of consequence, and growing year by year in the prominence assigned to it, until with some men it has become the sole pursuit in life. The present age is obsessed with its importance in a singular degree. The American nation is obsessed with it beyond all other nations. Books are printed on it, magazines are devoted to it, men learnedly discuss its secret. I refer, as the reader has probably divined, to the question of success. You observe that I spell it with the majuscule. The meaning of the word thus spelled is at once broader and narrower than that of the ordinary word. Broader because it is taken to mean success in life. Narrower because it has come to imply a peculiar kind of success. It means, first of all, a material success. It is a synonym for getting on. Where you get to is thought of more consequence than what you are. Worshippers of success hold in contempt the man who is capable of enjoying life in obscurity and on $30 a week. They measure happiness externally, not internally, objectively, not subjectively. Some, a growing clan, gauge success directly in proportion to the number of dollars on which a man pays income tax. Others, less narrowly, would accord a place to fame, which is apparently conceived not so much as having the high estimation of one's fellows, as it is having one's name known among a large number of them. Now, implicitly or explicitly, this kind of extrinsic success is taken by the majority of persons as the measure of the intrinsic worth of a man. And that is why so many of us pursue it. Not for itself, not because we personally would give a BlackBerry for it, not because it is indispensable to our inmost happiness, but simply that we may excite the envy of others and seem happy in their eyes. We have a strange habit of estimating our own happiness by what other persons think it is, and their opinion is likely to be based on our material success, since they have little else to go by. We continually try to obtain the things that the people around us want or profess to want, rather than what we want ourselves, because we have never really tried to examine whether there is any difference between the two. In trying to find whether we are hot or cold, we attach more importance to a dubious thermometer than we do to our own feelings. Now, this kind of success, which I have gone so far out of my way to become sarcastic about, is not commonly attainable without the possession of one characteristic, a characteristic of far more importance in this respect than thrift, intelligence, industry, or common sense. That characteristic is a passionate desire to succeed, a desire so strong and overbearing that it amounts to a demand, and that, in the strictly economic sense to which I have before referred, means a willingness to pay the price. The price is, first of all, singleness of purpose and concentration of effort. Nearly all of us, at school, have thought that we should someday like to be President of the United States. But not all of us have made it a point to study the lives of past presidents to see how they did it. Not all of us have taken a law course with that special end. Not all of us have refused tempting commercial opportunities for certain poverty and struggle for a time, to gain an end in which the mathematical chances were ridiculously and overwhelmingly against us. Not all of us have kept desperately fanning the embers of dissatisfaction, fanning them into a constant white-hot flame. With most of us, the early fire dies, the embers fade, and grow cool. We reach as high a level as we ever seriously hoped to reach. We have spasms of dissatisfaction with our position in the world, but not sufficient dissatisfaction to make us work our way out of the rut to a higher position. We have moments of longing for the mountaintops, but not enough longing to make us willing to give up something for them. Strolling in the valleys is so much more pleasant than climbing. And singleness of purpose demands more sacrifices than mere industry. It involves giving up all pleasures that interfere with it. They may be quite innocent pleasures, their sole offense being that they occupy time. It involves making oneself narrow. One cannot be a success in any one line if one dissipates one's energies in a number of activities, unless, of course, one be a versatile genius whose energies overflow, like Benjamin Franklin, Leonardo da Vinci, or Goethe. And such instances are so rare that they may be ignored. Let there be no mistake. I do not mean to discourage efforts to become a success. I mean merely to indicate that the goal has a price. I want you merely to ask yourself whether you are willing to pay that price. To ask yourself candidly how far you want to go and how much you are willing to pay. For if you do not ask yourself now, before you make your success resolutions, you are likely to ask yourself later on. As you see obstacles and disappointments pile up, you are apt to begin wondering whether the game is worth the candle, whether the colors of the reality are as gorgeous as those of the painting. And if you decide to give up then, you will have broken your early resolution, with all the undermining of self-confidence and faith in your will which that involves. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Scale of Values. In spite of the disclaimer at the end of my last chapter, I am sure to be accused, because of the satiric remarks preceding that disclaimer, of disparaging ambition. And I may not only be denounced for this, but I shall be told that of all places in which to disparage ambition, a book purporting to show the way to willpower is the strangest and most unforgivable. But I hasten again to assure the reader that I have not disparaged ambition at all. I have only disparaged ambitions. I have merely intimated that many of our ambitions are misdirected. We are worshipping false gods. A man in our day who laughs at the idea of taking seriously Zeus and Jupiter is not denounced as irreligious. In fact, he would probably be called irreligious if he did take them seriously. A time will come, I prophesy, when a man who bows down before our present popular conceptions of success will be denounced as lacking in ambition. But there is a liability to misunderstanding more important than this. Many will derive the idea from some of my past remarks that the only thing I regard of importance is what a man actually does and does not want, and that I am not concerned with what he ought to want. This is a misinterpretation which cannot be allowed to pass. I have not, and I cannot dwell at length upon what our ideals and aspirations ought to be. That is a subject for ethics, and I am talking of willpower. But for the sake of clarity, perhaps it were well that I indicate my position on this point. We have seen that every ambition has its price, and that, before launching yourself formally upon the attainment of any ambition, you must first of all ask yourself whether it is worth its price. But the value of accomplishing an ambition, or the sacrifice involved in securing it, are not objective things. They exist in your own mind, and they may be changed in your own mind. An analogy will make this clearer. Whether or not you decide to pay $100 for an overcoat depends both upon the value you attach to the overcoat and the value you attach to the $100. The worth you set upon the coat will depend upon whether you are without an overcoat altogether, or whether the one you have was acquired 6 years ago, or whether you just bought an overcoat last week. The value you attach to the overcoat will also depend on whether you are enamored with the style of it, or whether you laugh at the style of it. And such things depend quite as much upon your own tastes as they do upon the overcoat. The value you attach to the $100 will depend on whether you are earning $25 a week or $2,500 a week. Finally, the value you attach to the $100 and to the overcoat will depend upon your whole scale of values, your entire gamut of tastes and likes and dislikes, upon how many other uses you can think of for the $100, upon whether you attach more importance, say, to a $100 set of books, upon how much importance you attach to dress generally, and how much to money as a whole. In short, the value of a tangible object, unlike its weight, shape, and dimensions, does not inhere in the object itself. It inheres in you. The weight of a long ton of coal will always be exactly the same as the weight of a long ton of bricks, but the value of a ton of coal will not always be $15, either to you or to the community as a whole. Now, what applies to economic values applies with equal force to social and moral values, and I am here speaking of these values as they are, not according to any notions of what they ought to be. These too exist not objectively in the outward world, but in your own soul. When I advise you first to consider the price before setting out after any ambition, the decision you take may still differ from that of your neighbor, who takes similar forethought. Imagine two men, each able to foresee perfectly all the consequences of his actions, and each trying to decide whether to make it his ambition to amass $1 million. The first may enjoy putting forth effort. He may relish competition and strife. He may be satisfied with a narrow and exclusive devotion to his business, and the attainment of $1 million may seem to him an attainment glorious beyond all other attainments. It is not difficult to see that such a man would go ahead with the struggle for this object. But the second man, equally far-sighted, may be by nature more indolent, or, though possessed of equal energy, he may have a wider range of interests. He may like pictures, music, literature, philosophy, travel, or women. The ambition for $1 million may seem to him a ridiculous and childish ambition. He may feel that an income of $7,500 a year suffices for all his needs. It is not difficult to see that, for him, the price attached to amassing $1 million would seem prohibitive, and the end not worth the gaining. But we must pass from this consideration of what men do and do not want to the question of what they ought or ought not to want. Of two men, that man who has the more ambition, who is prepared to make the greater sacrifices, must be admitted to have the more willpower. But he is not necessarily the more admirable character. I am all for ambition and success, But what I remonstrate against is the particular kind of ambition and success which is usually held up to the young man of today to emulate. It is usually narrow and material and nearly always selfish. A man ought to set himself as a high goal, and he ought to attach a high value to that goal. Further, he ought not to attach too much importance to obstacles and sacrifices. He should welcome these as challenges to test his mettle. But the goal must be great enough to make the obstacles and sacrifices worthwhile. And it may be questioned whether a purely material and selfish goal does that. What ought a man's goal to be? Stated in the most abstract terms, it ought to be, beyond the mere duty of making himself happy, to increase social well-being, to confer the greatest benefits he can upon humanity. But instead of this, what do 9/10 of the success writers exhort us to do? They point to the great material successes, the men who have gathered in more engraved paper than other men, the men who have attained fame. And they tell us to ape such as these. It is true that a very large number of successful men in the process of attaining money and fame have incidentally conferred benefits upon mankind. That is one of the ways of acquiring money and fame. In order to get ahead, you may work harder than the man at the desk beside you. You may study at home. You may be more efficient. You may devise plans for saving the firm money. You may patent an invention. And by these methods, adopted primarily that you yourself may get ahead, you are adding to your productivity. You are increasing the world's supply of goods and services. You are conferring benefits upon mankind. Though your end is selfish, you are compelled to help others in order to attain it. In order to persuade people to give you a lot of money, you are obliged to confer equivalent benefits upon them. But if the pursuit of what you call material and narrow and selfish leads to all those beneficial results, someone may ask, what objection can you possibly have to them? My objection, my dear sir, is simply this. So long as fame and money are the ends sought, the benefits conferred upon humanity are mere byproducts. Whereas, in any civilization worthy of the name, the ends sought by individuals ought to be social well-being, and fame and money the byproducts. When money is the end sought, and social well-being merely the byproduct, we produce more money than we need and not enough well-being. We overeat and overdress and turn out mountains of silly luxuries. We seek to outdo our neighbors in material display, while the enrichment of the mind and the elevation of the soul are ignored, or occupy us only in moments when we have nothing else to do. Material wealth is all very well in its way. A certain amount of it is an indispensable preliminary to any culture of the spirit whatever. Unless a man have enough to eat, his brain will not for very long be able to function. But after we have acquired enough wealth to live in comfort, which does not include silly competitive display, we ought to turn to a higher and better things. I feel like shouting. For God's sake, man, can't you see that the acquisition of wealth is a means and not an end? It is further and finally to be said that the man whose sole ambition is to accumulate wealth, and even to do so honestly, must give people what they want, and not necessarily what is good for them. A theatrical manager can gather a fortune by staging salacious plays. There is a moving picture actor with an irresistibly funny way of wiggling his feet. He acquires hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for making people laugh, while college professors starve for trying to make people think. Yet after all this, there is something to be said for the ordinary selfish ambition. It is vastly better than no ambition at all. Though the benefits it confers on others may be incidental, it does confer them. And those benefits, even if they are usually material, are often vast. The world would be a very meager place if we lost our selfish ambitions without acquiring altruistic ambitions in their stead. And from the standpoint of willpower, which is, after all, our present subject, there is a very great deal to be said for selfish ambitions. Huxley, in his lecture on scientific education, happens to have said this so well that I cannot do better than quote his words. Quote, I do not wish it to be supposed that because I happen to be devoted to more or less abstract and unpractical pursuits, I am insensible to the weight which ought to be attached to that which has been said to be the English conception of paradise, namely, getting on. I look upon that getting on as a very important matter indeed. I do not merely mean for the sake of the coarse and tangible results of success, but because humanity is so constituted that a vast number of us would never be impelled to those stretches of exertion which make us wiser and more capable men, if it were not for the absolute necessity of putting on our faculties all the strain they will bear for the purpose of getting on in the most practical sense. End quote. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Controlling one's thoughts. After this ethical interlude on life's ideals, perhaps we had better take our bearings again. We have seen that whatever our ideals, whatever our resolutions, we should, before adopting those resolutions, calmly and coldly count the price of carrying them out. That was our first rule of willpower. Now the second rule follows naturally from the first. Once you have made your decision, having coldly decided that this is what you want and that you are willing to pay the price, your decision is forever beyond dispute. You should never ask yourself again whether the other course is possible, whether it is really worth while staying home to study for a specified number of evenings each week, whether a man who has resolved to stop drinking can really do so suddenly without blowing to pieces, whether smoking is really as harmful as you had thought it was, whether a man in a moderate position, without so many responsibilities and burdens on his shoulders, doesn't really get just as much enjoyment out of life as the success. Those questions are forever closed. You have asked them before and have decided them. You will know that thoughts determine action, and to control your actions you will begin by controlling your thought. You will vivify all the advantages that will come from carrying out your resolution. You will paint them in glowing colors. You will dwell on them constantly. The disadvantages you will ignore. They are disadvantages only to fools. A wise man does not think them so. Here I need to give a warning. Concentrate on the positive side. Avoid the negative. That is, dwell on the benefits of carrying your resolve out, not on the evils of failing. If you would fight a craving for morphine, do not let your imagination revel in the picture of the ashen-faced, palsied, loathsome, and pitiable creature you would be as a morphine fiend. Picture the upstanding, energetic, healthy-complexioned, respect-compelling man that you are going to be if you refuse it. A morbid, terrible picture is a mind-filling picture. It exerts a strange fascination. If a thought once sufficiently fills the mind, be it never so terrible, unreasonable, or self-destructive, it will be acted upon. I need merely cite the familiar experience of dizziness when looking over a precipice or a high building, or even a low building if there be no rail around. The height from sea level has nothing to do with it, and the height of the potential fall is less important than the actual danger of falling. You grow dizzy because you think of what would happen to you if you lost your balance and fell, or even if you were to throw yourself off. The higher the roof or precipice, the more fascinating does this idea become, hence the greater dizziness. It is the very terror of the thought, the reality of the fear that you are going to act upon it, that makes you dizzy. If you could get completely rid of the idea, you would completely lose the dizziness. I knew a man living in Buffalo who did not dare to visit Niagara Falls, lest he should throw himself into the magnificent rapids just above them. There are doubtless many like him. Fill the mind with the positive idea of your resolve, and you will carry it out. Some readers will have recognized an affinity between this rule and the doctrine known as suggestion. Little is yet known of suggestion, but enough is known for scientific men to become assured that it is no mere superstition. Practicing physicians recognize its great value. One writer, T. Sharper Nelson, convinced of the theory, has made some pointed remarks on the subject. Quote, "We have not to aim at a strong will and wait until it comes. Act as if it had already come. The man who feels he cannot pass a public house without an irresistible temptation to enter and drink to excess must tell himself he can and proceed to walk past the place of temptation." End quote. He suggests a method for combating insomnia. One should say to oneself, "I sleep, I sleep," repeating these words until a state of drowsiness is induced. Quote, "It is wrong to say, 'I shall sleep,' because that implies desire, and hence a possibility of non-fulfillment. Suggestion works by affirmation, not by promise." End quote. My next piece of advice is this: never defy temptation, evade it. You may look upon this advice as inconsistent with the above quotation. You may dismiss it as unworthy. I maintain that it is prudent. For urging it, I have the strongest psychologic grounds. In one of his studies in pessimism, Schopenhauer makes a remark to the effect that man has thousands of desires, and as at any moment not more than a few of them are fulfilled, man's existence must necessarily always be miserable. Schopenhauer could only arrive at a conclusion so opposed to common sense because his psychology was defective. Desires are not ever present. Desires are like thoughts. They are thoughts. They come and go. They are aroused by association and suggestion, and less apt to appear when there is no association or suggestion to call them up. I walk along the street. I am, so far as I am consciously aware, content, which is the same thing as being so. But I pass by a fruit stand. I espy some delicious peaches, and there is immediately aroused the desire for peaches. The absence of the fruit then produces in me a maw which must be filled. When I watch an exhibition tennis match, my desire to become a marvelous player is intense. When I go to a skating rink, I attach great value to the personal achievement of expert skating. When I read a book on the history of metaphysics, I desire to become a great philosopher. When I listen to speeches in the midst of a presidential campaign, I fancy that the one thing worthwhile is to become an eminent statesman. Between campaigns, this ambition falls into the background. If I have not been skating for a long time, my desire for preeminence in it fades. The moral of all of this, on its positive side, is to cultivate most your desires for those activities which will best forward your final purposes, those purposes which you have calmly, deliberately, and fully reasoned out. On the negative side, the moral is to avoid all associations, suggestions, lines of thought, which arouse desires that interfere with your final purposes. That is to say, desires that you have resolved against. The drunkard often has little difficulty in keeping straight, until he sees liquor. Even then he is better able to resist than after he has scented or tasted liquor. If you have resolved forever to cease drinking, do not, to show the strength of your determination, as people do in motion picture dramas, put the red glass to your lips and then set it down. Putting the glass to your lips is liable to be your undoing. Do not raise the glass. Do not order the drink. Do not enter the saloon. If the saloon is directly in line on your way home and habit has dictated your entrance, walk a block out of the way if necessary. Dr. Knowlson says that you should tell yourself you can walk past, and then do it. That is all very well for the later stages, but I fancy you will find that suggestion and self-faith have their greatest value when not overstrained. You cannot lift a 500-pound weight at arm's length by telling yourself that you can. But by gradual exercises, adding a little bit each week, a man may develop a physique which may enable him to accomplish marvels he never dreamed of before. And the will is just like that. It must be developed slowly. This is not my discovery. Bacon discovered it some 3 centuries ago, and though his language is somewhat antiquated, his wisdom is as wise today as on the day it was written. Quote, "He that seeketh victory over his nature, let him not set himself too great nor too small tasks. For the first will make him dejected by often failings, and the second will make him a small proceeder, though by often prevailings. And at the first let him practice with helps, as swimmers do with bladders or rushes. But after a time, let him practice with disadvantages, as dancers do with thick shoes. For it breeds great perfection, if the practice be harder than the use." End quote. Therefore, it is better to walk around the block a while, if you must, before going past. Then you may have faith, and your faith will be strengthened by the modest record of avoidance behind you. This alcoholic illustration, as I have indicated before, may be legally obsolete, but it is sufficient to indicate to a reader fertile in ideas the application of the principle to any other instance. End of Chapter 8.